Hey there, Dave here, and before we get to today's episode about Final Fantasy IV, there are some announcements and thank yous per usual. I've done a couple of guest appearances recently that you can go listen to. First of all, the King of Games 1996 tournament is raging on over on the Retro Hangover podcast. We're late in the tournament now, and the most recent episode was about Tomb Raider versus Resident Evil. I was on that episode as one of the judges, and one of the guests on today's episode about Final Fantasy IV, Chris, is from the Retro Hangover podcast. So go check that out. Also, part 2 of Pixel Project Radio's 1000 Times Resist analysis should be coming soon, so you can go check out part 1 if you didn't listen yet, and keep your eyes peeled for part 2, Pixel Project Radio's 1000 Times Resist coverage, and I was a guest on that too. So now, I just want to say thank you to the patrons who help support the show, heroes like Chris Nelson, the Top 3 Podcast crew, Chris Coplien, Eric Guess, Rick Firestone, Nick Fakori, Jill, Jeff, formerly Jerf, Kieran, Soccer, ZNA, Cupcake, Kyle, Christian S., Matt aka Stormageddon, JD, Doug Leaf, Jason Emery, Brian Skirsha, Randall, Jake Martin, Jenny E., Kurt Mattis, and many more. Thank you all for your support. I really appreciate it. Everyone else, you can be like them and support the show over at patreon.com/RealDaveJackson. And with that being said, time to board Sid's airship in Final Fantasy IV. Hello, everybody. My name is Dave Jackson, and you're listening to Tales from the Backlog. This is a video game deep dive review podcast where each week I'm joined by a guest to bring a game out of the backlog, play it, and discuss. I have two wonderful guests today. They are both friends of the show. The first guest is a returning guest to the show. He is one of the co-hosts of Retro Hangover and is the spooniest bard in the land. Welcome back, Chris Coplien.
I love the spooniness. I just love it. I'm going to go fight a fish creature with a harp now.
There we go. Makes a lot of sense. Yeah. And second guest is a new guest on the show. Love to welcome her on. She's a writer, and if you ask her nicely, she will legally change your name. Welcome to the show, Jenny E.
Thanks for having me. I guess I'll go by Naming Way now.
Yeah, there we go. Yeah, so it's good to have you both on today, and a game that I think is perfectly fitting for the both of you. Today we're going to talk about Final Fantasy IV, and Final Fantasy IV is an RPG developed and published by Square for the Super Nintendo in 1991. If this is your first time listening to the show, first of all, thank you for stopping by. Here's how spoilers work. We, as always, are not going to spoil the story for you for a while. We're going to talk about things about the story, talk about some of the characters and themes and things like that, but we won't spoil specific story events for a while. So check down in the show notes if you want a timestamp for when spoilers begin, then you can jump out if you don't want to be spoiled. Previous Final Fantasy games on the show, this is probably the most well-represented series on the show at this point. Final Fantasy VI, 9, 10, 10-2, 16, 7 Remake, and the greatest game of all time, Stranger of Paradise, Final Fantasy Origin. So a lot of Final Fantasy. We're adding a new one here today. We have some elevator pitches for everybody. What is Final Fantasy IV? I say this might not be fair, so correct me if I'm wrong, but the game where Final Fantasy became a series about stories and characters primarily. Chris, what would you say? What's the pitch for Final Fantasy IV?
Final Fantasy IV is the traditional JRPG that really established what it meant to be a traditional JRPG and advanced the genre forward in almost every conceivable way.
There we go. And Jenny, what would you say?
I wrote that it was a traditional RPG with a classic hero's journey, and everything you guys said is spot on too.
Good. I'm glad we're starting out the show with things that are correct, and I'm not already wrong. For this episode, I played... so there's a lot of versions of Final Fantasy IV out there. It was a big mental struggle for me to figure out which version to actually play. I played the PSP version because it looked pretty. So I did play that emulated on my Steam Deck. It took 25 hours to beat. And I assume the two of you have played the many different versions before. So what's the most recent one you guys played?
The most recent one I've played, I actually played it on stream, was the Pix Remaster for Steam. That took me about 16 hours, I think. So that's the most recent.
I also played the Switch Pixel Remaster, but I played it on the Switch, and that took me about 24 hours. But I played all the versions except for the PSP version.
Okay, so I played the one that you haven't played. So we will, when necessary, I think we can compare like the differences between the versions, but that's not going to be like the point of this episode. But for certain things, since there are so many versions, we might want to make a recommendation for which one maybe a newcomer could play or something like that. But we'll get to that when we do our recommendations. Let's talk about our histories with Final Fantasy IV and with the Final Fantasy series in general. So, Chris, I will kick it to you first. You've been on many a podcast, including your own, talking about Final Fantasy, but I think this is the first Final Fantasy game you've been on Tales from the Backlog for. So
I think so, yeah.
Tell people about your history with the series and Final Fantasy IV in particular.
So with the series in particular, my Final Fantasy journey, I think, started around 1993 or 1992, somewhere around there. Mm-hmm. And it actually started with the very first Final Fantasy. We were over at like a day sitter's house, daycare sitter's house, whatever you want to call it. And they had a bunch of video game systems downstairs. And one of the games that they had there was Final Fantasy for the Nintendo. Mm-hmm. And I'm sure whoever really wanted to play it hated us because every single day after school for about a month, we'd restart a new save. So there's only one save slot. So if anyone was actually trying to make progress, that never happened. So sorry about that. But I went from there, and the very next Final Fantasy I played was Final Fantasy Mystic Quest. I don't remember caring much for that. Not because I thought it was bad. I thought there's a lot of good qualities about it, but it wasn't quite the Final Fantasy that was there, especially when I knew Final Fantasy II existed. So I think I rented that from Blockbuster a couple times as well. These were both rentals. I never owned them. I just rented them. And then I remember getting an article of Game Informer right around the time this was after I got Final Fantasy for Christmas, because I was so invested at it at like my day sitter's house, that I remember reading an article in Game Informer that I had to go back to because it was the same one that I think Mortal Kombat 2 and Donkey Kong Country were a part of. I've tried going back and looking for it through Internet Archives. I can't locate the issue. I know what month it's in, but I can't find it. But and I was more interested in comparing the Super Nintendo and Genesis version of Mortal Kombat 2 at the time, and of course Donkey Kong Country. But then I remembered, oh right, I remember another game with Final Fantasy in there. Let me take a look. And it said Final Fantasy 3, and it said, oh, is this the greatest RPG ever? And so I bugged my dad for that for my birthday, and really ever since then it's been off to the races with the Final Fantasy franchise. Just head over heels in love with it for a very long time. I just think most of modern gaming has kind of leveled me out in terms of my obsession over it. But yeah, I was definitely a big Final Fantasy head for a very, very, very long time. Now, in terms of Final Fantasy II, I think the first time I did play it was when I was renting it from Blockbuster. And I think the very first time I actually did a deep dive into it was probably around 1998 with the rise of emulators and playing the hard type version of it, because all the rage on the internet was how much better the hard type version was. You weren't getting the real Final Fantasy if you were playing it on the Super Nintendo. No, you had to get the fan translation or else you weren't a hardcore gamer.
Right.
So I think that's the first time I really did a deep dive into it. And I think that Christmas too, I ended up requesting it as a gift from Santa, of course. I knew Santa wasn't real, but let's just play that off. But I requested Final Fantasy 2, and I got Final Fantasy 2 for Christmas from, I'm assuming, the local Funko Land, RIP. And then I played it there. And so that's really where, I wouldn't say that's even where my love for Final Fantasy 4 really was grounded. Like, I liked it. I appreciated it, but I was always the Final Fantasy VI fanboy. Like, oh, it's always the best one. And then as I got older and just replayed it more and more, that became the Final Fantasy that I was like, everything about this is just fundamentally sound. And it is one of those games that just scratches my itch. And it just became my favorite Final Fantasy in the series because it was hard for me to really find any flaws in it the longer and longer I played it. I just ended up finding it so endearing and loved it. Yeah. So I'm sorry I took a little long there, but that's my relationship with the series.
Well, it's a series where people do have long and complex and detailed relationships with. I mean, I do too, for sure. But before I talk about myself, Jenny, I will kick to you your history with Final Fantasy and then specifically FF4.
So this is going to be super nerdy in a minute. The game released in 91 and I was about 6 to 7 years old when I first played it with my brother. It was a super influential game for me. I got really invested in the characters and the story, the gameplay. I would play pretend with my friends outside. We'd play the characters. Back in the day during AOL chat room days, I would role play as characters on it. I wrote embarrassing fan fiction for it. You know, this game has been my favorite game and my favorite game to replay like my entire life. Different versions offer different experiences, and I've really enjoyed going back through and playing all of those. And, you know, I love this game. It's my favorite game. It's my favorite game to talk about. You know, I like the series, you know, Final Fantasy overall. Like I do enjoy it, but Final Fantasy IV is definitely like my favorite of the bunch.
Okay, so 2 longtime players of Final Fantasy IV, and then with me, this is my first time playing it for the podcast here. My first Final Fantasy game, I believe, was FF6 on the Game Boy Advance, and then FF10 after that, and then I think 13 was the first one that I bought when it came out, like at least within the year that it came out. So I a relatively late convert to the series, but I have now gone back and played most of them. The only ones I have not touched, at least, are the MMOs and 1 through 3 and then 5. Everything else I've at least played for a couple hours. So, as evidenced by the amount of Final Fantasy on the podcast here. But this is my first time playing it, and I specifically wanted to make this the next one that I play because I know of the ones left that I had not touched, this is the one that has the most love out there for it from people like the both of you. I mean, the 3 of us talk about games in Discord and stuff all the time, so it's not a surprise that you 2 are the guest for Final Fantasy IV here today. But that was kind of what made me want to pull this one out first before I go play some of the other ones. So my first time playing it here for the show, and I found this to be a pretty breezy, good time for the most part. The PSP version, I understand, is maybe a little bit easier than some of the other versions, which is perfectly fine with me. I don't mind that at all. And I kind of appreciated this. Like, I appreciate the story that's going on, but it's easy to see in like a historical context how they were building out the storytelling, like the way they wanted to tell stories in the series. As compared with what I know about some of the previous Final Fantasy games. So when we say in the elevator pitch, this is like the game that's like a turning point in that way, when you go back and play it, you definitely see that. It might be a little bit bare bones in some ways when compared with, you know, future RPGs. And I'll talk about that for sure later. But what's here is still really good. I enjoyed this a lot. Now, I know that you both have basically said this is your favorite Final Fantasy game, but are there any other kind of opening thoughts about Final Fantasy IV before we dive in proper?
Yeah, I think that how the story interacts and influences the game mechanics was kind of new for the Final Fantasy series and the RPGs in general. And it was just the story and the character development gets the player invested right away. We've talked about the story a little bit, but you know, it gets you right out of the gate. You're invested in the main character's story and what he's got going on, and what happens to the characters like matters to you as a player. Like, you're invested when you lose somebody. You're invested when someone leaves the group. You're invested when someone achieves something. And I think that was really part of what really grabs me in this game, is that it matters.
I think for myself, I'm going to say that if you're going back to this game in a a modern frame of mind and you've never played it before, I think one of the things that is going to shock you is the pacing and how good the pacing is. Are there times you're going to have to grind? Yeah, sure, certainly. It's an older game and those kind of things are to be expected. But there are times in this game where it would be like, man, I feel like I put 10 hours into this game in a good way. Like I've been playing for so long and wow, so much has happened. I have so much I can talk about and experience. And it's like, bro, you've been playing 2.5 hours.
Yeah.
Like, whoa, my mind is blown.
Yeah.
And we'll get into that with the story where there's that key point that we'll be talking about where if you go back and you're like, when did this happen? And most people are like, I don't know, 3, 4, 5 hours from the game. And you're like, no, that's like hour 2.
Yeah.
And that's just Final Fantasy IV. And just the story isn't the best story, but it's a solid story. It takes you along for a ride. And the characters, as I said before, are endearing. And this is a game that will provide a lot of charm to even for someone with a more modern state of mind. Its simplicity will be the draw, and it should be the draw, especially as you said, even of the time, when you think about a lot of games that be coming out the next year or two, a very almost simplistic minded JRPG that doesn't try to do anything too complicated and is all the better for it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. All right. Well, we've set up a lot of stuff to talk about, so we're going to listen to a little bit of music from Final Fantasy IV, and when we come back, we're going to give that story setup for what's going on. Final Fantasy IV opens with a fleet of airships flying home after a mission. The crew is a military unit called the Red Wings, and they're talking about the mission, and it's really interesting how this game begins because your crew, the Red Wings, have just done something really bad. They have just killed a bunch of innocent people in order to steal some crystals. And Final Fantasy, so that's a capital C on the crystals there. A flashback shows them going through, killing a royal family, killing guards, possibly killing civilians and stuff too. The captain, who Cecil?
Yes.
Cecil.
Which one?
Fine. I have probably made an ass of myself trying to say this is how you say it, so I'm not even going to try. I'm probably wrong no matter what I say. So I'm just going to say yes.
Safe assumption there. Jenny, how do you pronounce it?
I grew up with it as Cecil, but the DS version does Cecil, so I'm trying to default to Cecil. But I also know that Chris has a weird pronunciation for Kane too, so we're going to argue about that.
Oh, there we go.
Yes, we are.
So Cecil is scolding the soldiers. They're all talking about, did we do the right thing and things like that. Cecil scolds them and says that they did what was necessary to help their kingdom of Baron and that they could not defy the king's orders. They're just following orders. Monsters come and attack the ship on the way home. Cecil fucks them up really quickly. It shows you how powerful he is. And I always like that when games kind of show you, gamify that in the mechanics where there's like, whoa, this guy is strong. So this game does that right at the beginning. And Cecil kind of wonders to himself if these monster attacks are punishment from the gods for what he's just done.
A couple interesting tidbits here. And this is where we're kind of getting to the version differences, depending on what version you played first. Mm-hmm. In I think it's the American Super Nintendo version, there's dialogue in that opening scene where Cecil is just yeeting all the mages. He talks to the elder there and they have a conversation back and forth. But in the subsequent versions and even the original Japanese version, there's no conversation. So whatever you think is better, but that's only, I think, in the American original release. Mm-hmm. Also, the thing that he's doing to all the monsters. If you played this game originally for the Super Nintendo when it came out in 91, those are effects that can only be used from items because these are not things that Cecil can use. which also means that if you're playing this on the Super Nintendo, you can't do those moves. So everything Cecil is doing is something that you can absolutely not do in the game. Unless I'm wrong. I don't think you can use those.
No, I don't think so. Yeah. So yeah, he destroys those mages, kind of wonders if they've done the right thing, if he's being punished. Everyone's kind of like uneasy about it at the very least. So they get home. Cecil asks the king, hey, what's going on here? My men don't like what they've done. We're wondering what's going on. And the king immediately strips him of his command and sends him on a mission to slay an Eidolon, which are like the summons, the Final Fantasy summons. They call them Eidolons in this game, and deliver a ring to a village. So we go out on this mission, Cecil and his friend Kine. We already have a divide between the two of the guests here today. I think I remember Chris's pronunciation, so I trained myself to say Kine.
No.
It literally just because I've heard Chris say the name out loud before and not you, Jenny. It's nothing personal.
Of course.
It's Kine.
There we go. So Cecil and Kine are on this mission to deliver this ring. They slay the Eidolon. They deliver the ring. And oops, the ring is a bomb, basically. It destroys the village, unbeknownst to Cecil and Kine. They've been tricked. So, and it sounds like this is like along the lines of what Chris was saying earlier. It sounds like we're going hours into story and gameplay here. This is like 10 minutes into the game. So kind of setting up like these events that spur the story in motion. Everyone in the village is killed except for a little girl whose name is Rydia. This is the fun with these older games. I said Rydia. Yeah. So Rydia is the only one who survives. She's a little girl and she's a summoner. Cecil tries to help, but Rydia's pissed off because they just killed her entire village. She summons the Eidolon named Titan, who splits the land with an earthquake and separates our friends, Cecil and Kine. And that is how the game begins. Now you're separated from your friend. Cecil's like disowned from his kingdom, or at least removed of his command. So we just kind of like left to pick up the pieces, and the adventure begins from here. But I think that this is a really strong opening for the game. And for a game this, I don't know, of this era, it seems to me that this would have been an uncommon thing for an RPG to do. You have a character who's just done some really evil shit, and they're seemingly, like, maybe Cecil's trying to convince himself that it was okay, at the very least. But then we're split up from our party. We have this little girl that now we're going to try and take care of, even though you just killed her whole family. It's a pretty metal opening for the story of FF4.
And what I love about this opening, and kind of how this story develops as a narrative compared to other JRPGs of the time. I mean, you could look around and say other JRPGs were starting to tell decent stories with Phantasy Star, maybe. I think that may be more of a translation issue there, just because the blocks are small, they can only get so much text, so on and so forth. Mm-hmm. And Dragon Quest IV did a pretty good job as well. But in terms of, as I already mentioned before, like pacing and telling the story and getting you from point A to point B already, as you said, it sounds like a lot has happened. But, and even when you're playing it, like a lot of games, what they don't do well when it comes to the pacing is they make things feel like they're delivered too quick. And everything here just feels very natural. I think the other thing you mentioned is how Cecil or Cecil, whatever, I'm going to say it both ways throughout this episode. So forgive me. I'm never going to be consistent with it. But how Cecil, he does bad things and everything like that. And you could probably point to other RPGs of the time where that happens. But if you look back and you kind of think about it, they're really edgelordy. And that's not something that's happening here in Final Fantasy IV. Like, right. If you go to Megami Tensei, or I think it was the Megami Tensei, which was coming out this time, it was definitely on the NES. That's like straight edgelord shit. And we all know that. But, oh, you're controlling devils and worshiping Satan. Rawr! That's not what you're getting in Final Fantasy IV. So, yeah, it's definitely striking a much different tone in the ways that your hero is behaving and what your hero is doing right off the bat.
And as a hero, a lot of the early JRPGs, you're, a young, plucky adventurer, setting out on your first adventure for the first time, and you're level 1, you've got crappy gear. Whereas, Cecil and Kane, they're level 10, I believe, in most of the versions. They're already armored. They're seasoned soldiers. They're not, kids going out on a mission for the first time. It's an established, routine thing for them to go out and do missions together. So this shouldn't be anything more than what it is. It should be a routine mission. They should be coming back soon.
Yeah, 100%.
Yeah, that's very important. I'm glad you brought that up, Jenny. The other thing is, every other major RPG that you played at this time, your character starts at level 1. Cecil and Kyne start out at like level 10. Mm-hmm. And that's a very important narrative play on behalf of the people over at Square making it.
Yeah, and that's an example of one of the things that I thought was really cool and plays out throughout the game is this focus and this dedication to intertwining RPG mechanical stuff with gameplay with story stuff. So, for example, like you said, they start out at level 10. When Radia joins the party, she's level 1 because she's a child. By that point, Cecil is level 13. And so when you see things like that, you see, they're gamifying the fact that, okay, you're going to have to try and protect her in combat for a while until she can level up a little bit, because again, she's a child. So that's good. Some other examples here, character classes are important. Their RPG class is important to their characterization. The fact that Cecil begins as a Dark Knight, and Radia is a summoner. Those are their roles in the story, but that's also their character class. And it's something that a lot of games just take for granted, this character is this class. This person is a white mage. That's their job. It's not important for their character though. It's just their job. I guess Final Fantasy X is a bad example because they don't have strict classes that map neatly. But the fact that Lulu is a black mage in Final Fantasy X doesn't really say anything about her character, and that's not really part of her characterization. It's a huge part of Final Fantasy IV, though, and I thought that was very cool.
Also, going back to, if you want to use Final Fantasy X as an example, everything just fits neatly because they stick to the narrative, sticking to those classes. Look, for example, with Yuna. Yuna is a summoner, but if you put her on Tidus's or Auron's path on the sphere grid, now all of a sudden she's a brawler and she's, doing DPS and can tank. And that, if that's what Yuna does right off the bat, that doesn't feel natural, but you can do that as a player, which some might argue, well, that's awesome that I could do that, and fair to you. But when a class is more married to what their character is, and that's more represented through gameplay and the narrative, it does make everything feel much more put together and complete.
Yeah. Actually, Final Fantasy X maybe was a bad example to say that it never matters, because the fact that Yuna is a summoner is the thing about the story in Final Fantasy X. But other than Yuna, let's just ignore Yuna.
Yeah, I do think it's a good example though, for that reason, is they're telling you there's a class, but does the class really matter? Sometimes the class doesn't matter. But
not
here
all
of it does.
Yeah. Yeah, another example is that Radia is a mage. In addition to being a summoner, she can do black mage stuff. But at the beginning of the game, she knows Blizzard, she knows Thunder, she knows some other stuff, does not know how to use fire spells at the beginning of the game. And so you might be searching out elemental weaknesses like you do in these RPGs, and you're like, hey, wish I had a fire spell. That would be super handy. And Radia doesn't know how to use fire. She doesn't want to learn it because her village burned down, and she doesn't want to associate with fire. And when she learns fire in the story, it is a moment. She learns how to use a fire spell, and it is a character moment. And it's just something that, again, I play a lot of RPGs like this. This is not a very common thing. It's very cool to see the dedication. Again, there are so many examples that we could go through, and maybe we'll go through later in the spoiler section. But this is super cool. And again, it's a point of emphasis, we'll say. And I love that it's such a point of emphasis for the storytelling here. The other thing that you brought up before, that this game gets a lot of praise for is that pacing. It's super snappy. It's super quick. Like we said, I felt like I gave a very long introduction for the game, but what I did was explain how the first 15 minutes go in a 25-hour game. There's a lot that happens, and the story just keeps moving. Snappy, snappy. I thought that this was a breath of fresh air in a lot of ways, coming from like playing Lost Odyssey at the same time as this, which is like the complete opposite. That game is going in mud for a lot of it. Very slow game. This one keeps going. So I think that this is good. Sometimes I think this pacing is too fast, and it might be one of those places where I compare this to a more modern game, and I think about some of the storylines that happen in Final Fantasy IV, and I think like, well, they would have made the game 10 hours longer, and this storyline would have been expanded, and this character's motivations would have been looked into in more detail. This character would have carried this storyline throughout the whole game instead of this one section. So I think it's a little bit of a double-edged sword how fast this story moves. But I guess I would prefer this to just like this game being stuck in the mud all the time. But it is, I don't think the pacing is 100% a win and a great thing for the story.
I thought that, with everything happening in the story and how fast everything moves with the antagonist moving behind the scenes and Cecil's desperation to get to certain things, I think that the story kind of justifies how fast it goes because Cecil's constantly moving. He's constantly trying to counteract what the antagonist is doing. And I think that sets really the pace for the first like half of the game until you get a point where you can breathe and go through and collect things, but it definitely goes very quickly for Cecil, and he doesn't get a whole lot of time to react to things. And I think that's part of his tunnel vision with just getting the next task done, so that he can, do the thing and rescue the person and do all the things that he needs to do.
I would agree mostly with Jenny here, though I do think that there are points of the game where the pacing kind of does break down. I think that becomes more common once you get to, I don't want to say what part that is, but once you get to a second part of the game, and especially when you get to a third part of the game. That's where like the pacing goes all sorts of cattywampus in a way. But for the most part, like that first half of the game, I would say the pacing is near flawless, only comparable to probably Chrono Trigger in the way that it's executed. But there are times it's kind of like, why I thought I was done with this part. Why it feels like I'm going back to doing the same thing, even though it's a different area, but it's not really a different area. Or why do I have to keep coming and going back? This doesn't seem to really tie in too well. Those moments do happen. So I don't want to sit here and say it's absolutely pitch perfect, but for its time, certainly you don't ever get into a situation where you ever find yourself, with maybe one exception for me personally, sitting outside a town and grinding for experience and gold for an hour or two. That's just not something that happens in this game.
Yeah, the pacing is very good from that perspective. Like, you can generally just keep moving on to the next main place, and you don't have to stop and like we said, you don't have to stop and grind for a while. The thing that kind of like made me think about this is thinking about games like Chrono Trigger, which does have excellent pacing. And Chrono Trigger finds more time to deal with character stuff along the way, like within that snappy pacing, than FF4 does. And it just made me think like, if this game were maybe made 5 years later, 10 years later, they would have just done a little bit more. And I think there's a bit more that is left up to you, the player, to like connect dots and like figure out like, this is how this character is feeling in this moment. This is how Cecil must be feeling at this time. Whereas another game, like maybe FF6, would just have that character kind of ponder those things themselves. And that doesn't really happen here. But I do get what you said, Jenny, about like the tunnel vision, especially when you're moving from place to place, trying to follow that antagonist, or trying to rescue somebody or something like that. There's no time to sit and ponder. You got to move. So I think that like as an entire story, I do like how quickly it moves because I know what the alternative looks and feels like, and I'm not necessarily a fan of that. I think that there is a lot that is kind of left up to your imagination about how, characters feel about each other, with a couple of notable exceptions. And then the overall plot, the plot, the capital P plot of FF4 is nothing that special, but it does have some cool stuff along the way, I felt like, where you have some cool revelations about characters, where they come from, their backgrounds, things like that. And so even if it's not like a narrative that blew me away, it was still an enjoyable cast of characters. It was enjoyable situations that they find themselves in and things like that. It's not quite at that top level of JRPG stories that I love, but this is a good story. And so I don't want to give the impression that I was left without any detail to latch onto or anything like that. This was still a good time from a story perspective.
Well, and the nice thing about some of the other versions is they fill in the gaps on some of the story or what the characters are feeling. The DS version in particular, every character has thought bubbles that you can look at the menu, and you can see what they're thinking, what they're feeling. Some of them are hints on things that are going to come up. So you get a little bit more introspection on the DS version, a little bit more background on that too. But it definitely leaves a lot, up to the player's imagination on specifically on Cecil and how he's feeling.
Yeah, that's good.
And forgive me if I mentioned this before. If you're going back and playing this today for the first time, and you're like, man, this is just a lot of tropes. Yes, it is. It's a lot of tropes. But this was also, I guess, in terms of fantasy tropes, if you were probably big into fantasy stories, yeah, these were still all tropes for that. But in terms of fantasy JRPGs, this was establishing tropes. So yes, it's tropes. It's really tropes the RPG, but it was setting up a lot of those and making them standard or trope-ish.
Yeah, definitely established the tropes in the first place on a lot of things.
Definitely.
I think the other thing that I would like to just kind of touch on is the cast of FF4. We've mentioned a handful of characters so far: Cecil, Kyne, Rydia. That might be the only ones we talked about. There's also Rosa, who's a white mage, who is Cecil's lover, partner, something like that. There is a great Cid in this game, and kind of not just like the dude who flies the airship. Cid's an actual character who joins the party and is a general, just awesome dude. There are a lot of other characters that join the party, and the cast rotates a lot. So you'll never spend too long with the same group of people. I think one of the results of this is that the people who are there for most of it, like Rydia, Cecil, Kyne, they get the most characterization. Some of them I don't I finished this game not having any thoughts whatsoever about a few of the characters that join. But they're all generally a likable bunch. So it's not FF6 large of a cast, but there are a lot of characters, and I think that most of them are pretty fun to have around at the very least.
I can only think of really two that I think are underdeveloped, and unfortunately, one of them ends up as a party member at your final party. But I think all of them, for as short as this game can be, and once you get used to where everything is and you can play this game straight, you can beat this game casually in about 14 to 16 hours. So as short as that game is, the amount of development you get from characters that even have small roles comparatively to that final established party, I think they're well developed enough. And maybe it's just because I played the crap out of it, but I can look at almost every single character and be like, yeah, I like this character because of this reason, and I like this character because of this reason, even if they're only with you for an hour and a half. But I do think there's enough kernels and bits and little breadcrumbs placed even after they leave your party that can make them endearing. Now, there is a problem with a lot of the way the characters enter and come into your party, which yeah, it's a problem. I'm even going to say it. It's a problem.
You mean the way they leave the party?
Yes. Yeah. That becomes kind of funny after a while, and it's something that carries over from Final Fantasy 2 and 3. It's not something that Sakaguchi was afraid to do with characters at that time, or the illusion of which, whatever. I'm not going to say it. We'll get to that much later. But yeah. It becomes laughable.
Yeah, we'll get into that later for sure. And I think this is a good point to put a pin in story talk. We've kind of covered the top level stuff. Let's listen to a bit of music and come back, and we'll talk about those presentation elements like music and the way the various versions of this game look. So, visuals, this is going to be an interesting one because there are so many versions of FF4. I've only played the PSP version, and I'm just going to go ahead and say the PSP version in particular, and I've seen the way the others look, but the PSP version is hands down the best looking version of this game. And not only that, one of the best pixel art designed games I think I've ever played, especially enemy designs and character designs when they get blown up in the battle screen, antagonists, bosses, and then just like your regular enemies. They're just tons of fucked up, detailed little guys that you fight. Special shout out to the Ant Lion, who I think is one of the more famous enemy designs from the game. But all that to say, I primarily picked the PSP version because I heard it was a little easier and I knew what it looked like. And it looks fantastic.
Yeah, PSP is definitely the version that if you want the best visuals, that's it. That has the overall best looking sprites. I think the best looking character designs. I think that the Pixel Remaster actually pales in comparison. Well, pales is a strong word, but it does trail behind it quite significantly. And I like the way that the Pixel Remaster looks. I think that it does actually give the original Super Nintendo version a little bit of an upgrade, where that looks like a game that's coming straight out of the Nintendo to Super Nintendo transition.
Yeah.
It has a lot of similar sprites to Final Fantasy III, for example, if you played that on the Famicom. But yeah, I think it's the right move if you want to play this on the PSP version, if you can get a hold of it. And after that, in terms of visuals, definitely would say the Pixel Remaster.
Yeah, agreed. The PSP is definitely the prettiest. The Pixel Remaster, it does its job. You know, it's okay. It's better than the SNES version, but it gets the job done. I don't hate it.
And no praise out there for the way the DS version looks.
I love it.
You love it?
The
Okay.
DS. Yes,
There we go.
I do.
There we go.
I do love the DS version. I know it has a lot of problems, but like I love it overall.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm not really a fan of like the chibi look to the DS version, and I hate all the Pixel Remaster visuals in all of the Final Fantasy games.
Really?
Yeah, I can't stand it. It is an irrational thing at this point. Like I dislike it more than anybody probably should, I think. It started with it looks cheap. It looks like a cheap, well, okay, they kind of were cheap mobile ports. That's what it still looks like to me, but I don't want to spend a lot of time on this. It's a very irrational thing. I don't like it to the point where if I play the older ones, I will probably not play the Pixel Remasters. I will like slug through the NES version of FF1 instead of playing the Pixel Remaster.
You need to play the PlayStation version then.
Does it have like PlayStation load times to it?
Yes.
This is the cross that I bear, apparently.
Yeah. And don't worry too. You'll get CG videos from like 1995 PlayStation CG.
That's exactly what everybody needs in their life. Yeah. Something that I think we will probably all agree on is the music in FF4 is, it's composed by the longtime composer for the series, Nobuo Uematsu, and it's great. I love the music in here. The PSP version gives you a choice of like newer rearrangements of the songs, or you can just listen to the Super Nintendo versions. I chose the Super Nintendo versions because I thought they fit the pixel art better, and still great. I love the soundtrack pretty much front to back.
Yeah, the soundtrack is outstanding. I know a lot of Final Fantasy fans like to point to it as their favorite. Weirdly enough, even though this is my favorite Final Fantasy game, it's not my favorite Final Fantasy soundtrack. That one goes to 8. Don't tell anybody. But I've probably already said too much. But it's really good. I find it to be second best on the Super Nintendo, behind 6s and ahead of 5s, obviously. And I don't know. Like, after the Pixel Remaster remakes, I almost want to put it right behind 3s. But I mean, it's still phenomenal. You're talking about Uematsu here. So it's not like I'm going to be, in the middle of the pack, which means it sucks. No. It's definitely in my top third of Final Fantasy soundtracks, and it's classic and it's iconic. And you'll always hear people talk about the boss theme and the Battle of the Four Fiends. Those are the two tracks that like almost everyone points to as being fantastic.
Yeah, I really love the music in this. It's my favorite Final Fantasy soundtrack overall, my favorite video game soundtrack. A lot of the music really, really touched me. The moments became really important. Like Sorrow and Loss still makes me a little weepy every time it comes on, something sad happens. The theme of love, I always love that. It's a gorgeous song. It's all just really well done. I really enjoyed all of it.
Yeah, it's great. There's a lot of standouts in here. The battle themes, like Chris talked about, the boss battle music is fantastic. I like the regular battle music. It's always a compliment to a game like this when I don't eventually just turn it into a podcast listening game and just, listen to something else and turn down the game volume. I never did that with this. I thought it was just fun to listen to throughout. I love the tactical deployment of the Final Fantasy theme song, like the series theme song, which apparently that song makes me cry now. That's a new development that's happened since I played FF4. And one thing I thought was really cool, and it's one specific song, but the music in the village of Mysidia, which is a weird village full of black mages, Final Fantasy black mages, so they have that iconic design, is super obviously a precursor to Vivi's theme in Final Fantasy IX. Which was just cool as someone who played Final Fantasy IX. I love Vivi, of course, because I'm not a monster. And playing this game from 10 years before Final Fantasy IX, I think, something like that. And you can just hear like, oh, Uematsu had the idea. This is like the sound I'm associating with the Black Mages all this time before. It's a really weird, quirky song, but it's perfect. I love it. A lot of stuff in the soundtrack like that.
One of the things you can hear about what Uematsu is doing here, which really separated him from other composers of the time, is that his music was situationally dependent.
Yeah.
Where if you look at a lot of other games, especially during this time, and like a decade after, you'll have like one track play through an entire scene, even though there's different developments and things changing. And everything is almost cinematic in the way that he introduces music themes. Right off the get, the theme of the Red Wings, when they're approaching Baron and, they're reviewing what they did over in Mysidia. And that is just, everything about that's thematic. The approach, the very militaristic way of doing things. And you might be like, oh, it's kind of like, it's not like Star Wars, but you could kind of put that into the, I don't want to say the same level of iconicness as the Stormtrooper March, but like for a Final Fantasy game, it is. Like it's at that level. Just because of how it just sets the scene. And that's something that Uematsu would continue to do exceptionally well for a very long time. Up to this day.
Yeah.
Other things that are interesting about the music, and this might be more mythos, but Theme of Love was popular enough in Japan where it was taught in Japanese schools. And also Final Fantasy IV, I believe, is the first video game soundtrack to have a full-on arrangement. No, because there was a symphonic suite for 1 and 2, but there is a full arrangement for the soundtrack that I think had a CD release. And I need to go check the facts on this, called Celtic Moon, that came out in Japan. It's beautiful. It's written entirely in the way of like Celtic style, for lack of a better term, but it's a gorgeous soundtrack.
Yeah, it's really beautiful. I've heard it.
Nice. Yeah. I had also noted the use of character themes in here. And again, like I didn't play Final Fantasy 1 through 3. I don't know if Uematsu was doing this before, but something that became one of his, calling cards in later Final Fantasy game, these themes that are associated with a certain character or a certain place or something like that. That's all here too. You have individual songs for individual characters that come up during their pivotal moments in the story and things like that. That's here in Final Fantasy IV. A lot of those songs are really good, as you should expect at this point. So I expected to like the soundtrack because I knew who made it, but I didn't expect to find so many of the things that I associate with Uematsu and also with Final Fantasy in this one too. Like I didn't know how far back it went, and I still don't really know, not yet, but I did find it all here. So great soundtrack all around.
I just noticed that you wrote that the Red Wings theme sounds like Star Wars.
It did remind me of Star Wars. I was listening to it this afternoon and I wrote it down. I also wrote, I don't know why, I can't explain it, but maybe it is that imperialistic military march type of vibe to it. And, Star Wars is interwoven into my DNA at this point, but yeah, it did remind me. So when you brought it up, I was like, I know Chris is disagreeing with me, but he's agreeing with me.
Yeah. It's more, well, it's more positive than the Imperial. Is it called the Imperial Death March?
The Imperial March.
The Imperial March. It's far more powerful and less menacing, but it's very similar thematically. Yeah. I'll say that. By the way, I'm not the person to talk about music, so I am kind of making shit up, but there's my opinion.
What is a podcast if not making shit up?
I think you're absolutely right. So I proudly make shit up. You're welcome.
There we go. Yeah. So just like presentation, I probably helped out a little bit by the fact that I played the PSP version, but it was a pleasure all around, I would say. And I assume that the Pixel remaster, like the music is great. The DS version, I assume it's the same there. It's Uematsu. He doesn't miss.
One exception, the Wonder Swan version.
There was a Wonder Swan version.
Yes, that is it sounds like if they took Final Fantasy IV's music and put it on an NES. It is totally 8-bit. It's actually kind of cute.
It does sound, cute in a quaint kind of way. Yeah. All right, gameplay in Final Fantasy IV. Let's talk about it. This is the game that introduced ATB combat to the Final Fantasy series. And if you don't know what ATB combat is, listen to the many other like SNES era RPGs that use it. But it is the combat where you have a bar that is filling up based on your speed stat. When that bar fills up, you get to put in your command. All of your characters have this going at the same time, so they don't necessarily act in the same order all the time, and enemies have this going on in the background as well, too. It is supposed to give a more action feel to turn-based combat. I personally don't love ATB combat. I don't hate it. I am just used to it at this point. I don't think that like my speed in keying in things in the menu is particularly interesting as a tactical challenge, but I don't hate it either. I'm just like, it's one of those things. I played so many games with it. FF6 was my first Final Fantasy game, so I'm used to it at this point. Fans of ATB combat, Jenny, Chris?
I'm actually a big fan of it. I'm a bigger fan now than I have been in the past. And that was because of a member in our community, just Chimera from Game Over Hell, insisted that I play. Well, insist is a strong word, but highly suggested that I give the game a try on active, and says everyone plays it on wait, and that's why they don't care about it. But if you play it on active, you feel the tension, and that's what it's supposed to drive home. Is you have to make a decision, because if you don't, I know you've talked about this on the show before, so I don't want to beat it into the ground. But yeah, I'm a bigger fan of it now, and I think another thing is that's a common misconception. with a lot of games from that era using ATB. Because if you really go back, I just think it's how ubiquitous Final Fantasy became with JRPGs. You go back to that era, and Final Fantasy is really the only one doing it outside of Chrono Trigger
Final
and Parasite
Fantasy,
Eve.
Chrono Trigger, yeah.
But everything else was like doing either straight up turn-based or assigning a character based off their speed value and their stats. And that was the two different ways of doing it. So Final Fantasy was actually doing it much different than a lot of other games were doing it at the time, and doing it in a unique way. And I don't think it gets enough credit for that. But in some circles, maybe it gets too much credit. Whatever the case might be. I do think it's a misconception. You just described
Final Fantasy in general.
Yes, yes, I did.
Yeah. Jenny, you a fan of ATB?
For me, as a younger gamer, I liked how active it was and how present I was in the game. But now, as an older gamer, I'm falling asleep in the middle of battles. I'm waking up dead. So I had to put things on wait because I would fall asleep mid game. So I like that it has the option to set it to wait. Yeah. I also found on the Pixel Remaster version that the auto battler was less useful for me than it was in FF2, which I was playing at the same time. Whereas when I can program everything up front, at the beginning of, regular turn-based, that auto battler lets me program it a little bit better. Whereas with the, people constantly having their turn come up, I was constantly having to try to set up, where I wanted them to be for the auto battler. So I found it less useful. But I ended up turning it to wait just because I kept falling asleep during battles.
Yeah, that'll do it. Yeah. I had it on active, and you also have an option to change the speed at which the bar fills up, and I did not touch that in this game. Other games I've turned it up to help myself out a little bit. I think that was in Xenogears was the most recent one where I just gave myself a little bit of an edge there. But in this one, I just left it the way it came out of the box, and it was okay. One thing to note, I don't know if this is the same in all of the games. This game has random encounters, which I think is in all the games. But what may not be in all the versions of FF4 is the encounter rate on PSP is terrible. One of the most annoying encounter rates that I think I've ever played. It is often you'll do a battle, and then one square is another battle, and then two more squares is another battle, and then the next 45 seconds, nothing. And then 3 battles in a row. Very annoying to me. Might be a, what do they call that? Murphy's Law? No, not Murphy's Law. The principle that you only remember the bad things and you don't remember the things that are unremarkable. It might just be me remembering all those times when it was 3 battles on 3 straight tiles. But it was annoying. And it's so something that was not great in the PSP version.
If there's not a law or theory for it, there's a German word, I assure you, just like everything. Yeah.
Well, there is the theory that the best way to get an answer is to say the wrong thing. So hopefully someone will help me out when they hear this.
Especially on the internet, because no one wants to angrily tell you that you're saying something wrong on the internet ever.
Yeah.
I think you bring up another good point here, Dave, is that the difficulty here can be deceptive. Where I just felt this going through the Pixel Remaster as someone who's played it a ton. I do know that in the latest update through Steam, they definitely changed the difficulty a little bit. Just looking at the amount of hours I played, the final boss kicked my ass. I'm not ashamed to admit it. I got my ass kicked. And there were parts of the game where you get a lot of enemy counters when you attack them, or you attack them in certain ways. Probably more than any other entry in the series. And I didn't notice this or really think about it too much until members of our community pointed this out, once again, Disc Chimera. And it was the enemies are always countering you in this game. And I have always mentally prepared for that while fighting enemies, but I never really sat down and thought about it. It was like, that does happen all the time. And I've just adjusted to it. But yeah, that's something you don't see really in a lot of RPGs in general, but in Final Fantasy IV, it's happening a lot. And if you're not prepared, you can get wrecked. And it just happens occasionally. It doesn't happen with every enemy group or in every dungeon. It'll just come out of nowhere and be like, oh, you just want to attack this cat? Okay, he's going to kill you in a hit. It's just one of those things.
Yeah, there are not a lot. There's a couple of boss battles where you can't use some of your characters just because the counter mechanic will hit you and kill you. So you have characters that don't do anything other than defend or, use items because they're handicapped.
Yeah, that counter mechanic is like one thing that helps the thing that I'm about to say. But I felt like in Final Fantasy IV, most battles played out exactly the same way. And I have a bit more tolerance for this in games like this than I do cause this is something I like shit on the battle system in Xenoblade Chronicles for, because those battles are all exactly the same. Something about the turn-based, maybe the ATB is helping. I don't know. The strategy of using elements and things like that helps out in Final Fantasy a little bit more. But I did find most battles will just be like, okay, Cecil's going to attack. This other character that's an attacker is going to attack. Rosa is going to heal somebody. And then Radia is going to use whatever element this enemy is weak to. And that's basically how things go. Like at a certain point, Cecil can learn some spells. I rarely use them because Cecil should always just be attacking. And there's not a whole lot of times when like you need to really shake up your strategy other than the counters. And then in some of the late game dungeons, you do actually have to be like, okay, I have a specific strategy for this one enemy. Because if I don't do it, they will wreck my shit no matter what my level is. So for a lot of the game, it did fall in that pit, I think. But then later on, things do get more interesting from a strategic perspective.
See, and I feel like there's at least 2 dungeons early on that require you to like really rethink your entire strategy where, Cecil attacking isn't the most powerful in both those scenarios. So I think that like that kind of breaks it up, that helps break it up where you have to really rethink, how you're attacking, how you're relying on your mages in your group, how you're rationing out, your ethers. And that becomes really important in at least 2 of the dungeons.
Especially when your most powerful mage can't have their magic points go above 90.
Yes. That's what I was thinking.
That is something that is cool about this. And this is I'll say it's a divisive thing out there. So you say like your most powerful mage can't have a huge mana pool to pull from, basically. And there's not a whole lot you can do to change that because there is no character customization in this game, like almost whatsoever. You can maybe get some additional effects from weapons you equip or something like that. Other than that, you're not changing anybody's class. You are not teaching people new moves. They learn moves like Pokemon learn moves, basically. I actually love this. I think that it reinforces characters like from the story perspective. I actually don't like it when characters can be anything at all because they lose a bit of characterization, in my opinion. This is one of those games where if a black mage joins your party, they will always be the black mage, and they will probably be the only black mage for most of the time that they're with you. So I actually really like this, but I think that this is a divisive thing. So I would like to get your thoughts.
I actually entirely agree with you. That's one of the things that was able to push Final Fantasy IV above 6 for me. Is because when I would go back and play 6, especially later on, it's like, what's really the point of having 14 characters when all of them are just going to be Ultima machines?
Yeah.
Like
6 starts out really well with characters having like defined roles and stuff, but at the end, they all just use Ultima. You're right. Yeah.
Or if they don't learn Ultima, or you can't cast Ultima with them, you're leaving them on the airship and they're worthless. Like, just go away, Umaru. You were a novelty for a bit. But yeah, I mean, here it's like every character has a purpose. Kain can avoid damage through his jumps. Rosa can heal. Rydia causes a massive amount of damage with her spells. Cecil is a physical attacker that can heal when needed, especially outside of battle. And Edge dies. So you have a purpose for every single one of your characters here, and it's always good to know.
I'm glad that transfers over from the different versions too, because it just seems like for every 5 times the enemy attacks, 4 of them are going to Edge, and he's always going down.
Yes.
Did the PSP version have the like special skills that they had? Like Rosa has prey.
Yes.
Okay, so they had that too. So in the DS version, there is a little bit of the customization where through the augment system where you can trade off those so you can have, twin cast between, two other mages and stuff like that. So there is a little bit of that customization, but not nearly as to like the other Final Fantasy games where everyone can be anything. Your characters are in the roles that they're going to be in. They're not going to, move much out of that very much.
Yeah. And the thing that like, so you might think if you're listening and you never played, you might think like, oh, well, this is boring. I'm going to have the same party makeup the entire time. And that is not how it works out because people enter and leave your party with regularity throughout the entire game. Your cast is always different. And the number of characters you might have is different. So your strategies are based on who's with you rather than like building characters, we'll say. And I thought that this was an interesting way to, if they're not going to do the ultimate customization route, which I understand that, well, the first Final Fantasy game, you just kind of make characters with their classes. And other games in like this early era of the series have more build crafting and stuff like that. This game has this dedication to story and characterization. And so instead of making you build characters, they trade characters out all the time. And I thought, if I'm not getting customization from that other angle, the game is tailoring challenges and boss fights based on who's in the party at the time, which is good enough for me.
And I think it really helps you appreciate the characters when they leave. You're like, oh man, I just lost, my person who does this. What am I going to do now? So there's a lot of appreciation for the characters and their roles as they shuffle in and out of the party.
Yeah, you can't leave. These are my two best black mages. Like, I need them.
Right.
You can't leave, Edward. I need you to hide.
Please hide so they don't kill you. Like, that is your use in combat. Just hide behind that rock over there. We'll tell you when it's over.
Yeah.
Poor Edward.
So, I guess, like, all told, it's definitely not my favorite combat system. I like the stuff in 6 better just because characters feel more unique for the first half of the game. I like that part of it better, but this is something that I've heard criticism for, and it's definitely something that like comes with the recommendation. I think like if you love RPGs for build crafting and customizing characters and stuff, Final Fantasy IV is like not that game. It is 0% that game. But I love that. I like the dedication to the story.
And really outside of 1, it's the only Final Fantasy game like that. Aside from 9, but 9 has some level of customization, but
yeah, with the equipment system.
Yeah.
But yeah, a lot of Final Fantasy games at some point turn into your characters can be anything, so just go wild with it. And I don't want my characters to be anything. That stresses me out. Like, tell me, Dave, this character is a white mage. They'll always be a white mage. Use them like a white mage. And I'm like, okay, sweet, let's go.
Makes it easy.
So we're getting to the end of this non-spoiler section of the show, and so while I think I know the general idea when we ask what kind of recommendations would we give people about Final Fantasy IV, what type of person we would recommend the game to, I think I know that both of you would recommend the game in general, but what type of person do you think that this game would appeal to most? Jenny, I'll throw this to you first.
I think that anyone who likes RPGs in general and wants to get more of the history of where they started, especially the history of Final Fantasies in general and where all those, standard tropes started and standard mechanics, I think that's a great starting place for the history of Final Fantasy in general. It set the standard on a lot of RPG elements that you still see today, and I think it's a really important game in history.
I would recommend this game to anyone who's thinking about going back and playing retro games, but without all the inconveniences of the really mean kind of retro games, because this game is extremely accessible. And so if you're someone who has a slight interest in going back and playing those old Super Nintendo RPGs, this is the definitive place to start. I don't know. I know Jenny said I'm not trying to poo-poo on this, but I don't know if this is the place where I would say a person should start their Final Fantasy journey. It's not a bad place to start, certainly, but I think this is more for people who are more ingrained to the old games and are looking for a good place to kind of get their feet wet with an RPG experience. Far more than Mystic Quest, anyway. So, yeah, this is that kind of game. So traditional JRPG fan or just someone who's curious about how games used to be back in the day.
Yeah, I think it's a pretty easy recommendation for Final Fantasy fans who haven't played it yet, whether, no matter how far they've gone back. I don't really see, unless you only played 16 and you want action games or something like that, then, this is not that. It's very different. But, if your first Final Fantasy was 6 or 7 or 10 or something like that, then I think this one's a pretty easy one to jump into and see. And I do think that historical element to it, like Jenny said, is really easy to see as well, because you'll see, like, this is a thing that they're trying. And, like, in my opinion, it's not quite there yet, but it's still pretty good. And the quick pacing helps with people who might think that these games are too slow or too grindy or something like that. So I think this game does appeal to a lot of different people. You just have to be up for a JRPG and this type of combat and this type of, overworld and random encounters and all the things that come with things of this era, I guess we'll say. But with that being said, there's not a whole lot of caveats to recommending FF4. I had a great time with this. And so it's a easy one to say, like, you will probably have a good time too, as long as you don't hate the idea of playing a game like this. So, recommendations from all three of us. So before we get into spoilers, it's time for a little bit of housekeeping and time for us to talk about the things that we make. So, Chris, I will kick to you first. Tell the people about Retro Hangover and everything that you guys have going on over there.
Yeah, well, been here before, so if you haven't listened to those previous episodes, go back and listen to those that I was here with Dave on. I know Signalis was one amongst, I think, one other, just not at the tip of my mind. I should have came prepared.
Spec Ops: The Line.
Yes.
And the retro game evaluation roundtable episode.
All great times I had on the show. All great episodes that go back into the backlog for those tales.
That's
and
right. There be tales in yonder backlog.
There does be. But if you want to know what I do on my own podcast, I have a show over there with my partner Shane, where we talk about games that are 10 years or older. Sometimes we do console retrospectives and people retrospectives. We have all sorts of other shows over there, like a top 5 list and the King of Games, which Dave is part of, which is probably coming close to the end of its run, but you should go check that out. Dave does a fantastic job, and you might be hearing more from Dave in the future with the King of Games. And Dave was also on our show recently with Shovel Knight. Well, semi recently at this point, and that has gotten nothing but praise and acclaim, especially because of Dave's presence and how fantastic he was there. So if you like Dave, go check out the Shovel Knight episode. But if you want to know where you can find those things, just head over to linktr.ee/retrohangover, and just all the links to all the things are there. It's pretty easy to figure out, so I won't go over the specifics. But yeah, would love to see you as part of our community. Would love to hear your thoughts on the show over at that link. And once again, thanks, Dave, for having me on here today.
Of course. Always a pleasure to have you on. And this was Final Fantasy IV was a game that we had picked out a long time ago to have you and Jenny on here today to talk about. So yeah, lots of crossover between Tales from the Backlog and Retro Hangover. I feel like I mentioned the monthly review crew in the Retro Hangover Discord often on this podcast as the reason I'm playing some games. So there is that too. And go check out the King of Games 96, which should be, winding down to the big finale soon, we'll say, if not already. But a lot of good stuff in that tournament, and of course on the regular show as well. I was also on the show for Star Wars Knights of the Old Republic and Metal Gear Solid in years past, so people can go check those out too. And Jenny, your turn to tell people about your writing.
So I am a Final Fantasy IV fanfic writer. Big surprise. I have about 350,000 words across 17 stories. That includes 2 novel-length stories, one-shots, like short stories of varying sizes, 2 travel collections, which are short 100-word stories, and then 2 podfics, actually. You can find my work at archiveofourown.com under the username Jenny. That's JENNEH, like Forrest Gump. My podfics are on Spotify and Amazon Music under the podcast name Wordlessly. And my current project is a novel, A Theme of Love, and it follows Kane in before and after during the game's event. So it follows his narrative story. So that's what I do. You can find me in the Discord servers, all of them, under Jenny. And I've heard that if you talk about Final Fantasy IV, I will eventually be summoned. So, lots of ways to get in touch with me. If you want to talk Final Fantasy IV, that's my thing.
Yeah, exactly. So again, no surprise why you got an invite to come on and talk about Final Fantasy IV in particular. So yeah, people can definitely go check out all of the writing if you're interested in checking it out. Jenny's a very good writer and a good podcaster. Like I was very surprised when I listened and I was like, oh, this sounds not like somebody's first podcast that they've done, which is always a nice surprise when you listen to somebody's first. I know my first podcasts do not sound like that. So people can go down in the show notes to find everything that Jenny is doing and everything that Chris is doing. Lots of very worthwhile things to go check out. So for me personally, the same ways to support podcasts as always, the same calls to action. Ratings and reviews, I think, are something that I want to push for. I would really love, especially if you keep coming back to the podcast, I would really appreciate if you could leave a rating and review on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Podcast Addict, and the show's on YouTube also, which YouTube lets you do comments and all that shit. But you can do all of that. It's really helpful for people finding the podcast. So if someone goes in their podcast app and types Final Fantasy IV, they might find this episode, and that's what we want. We want people to find it. You can also join the Discord server and join the conversation about games on the show, about the podcast, about what games you're playing, and then everything else that an online community has to offer, like a bunch of really cool people to talk about, what movies you're watching, talk about your pets, things like that. We have an awesome community. Jenny and Chris are members of the community, beloved members. We would love to have you join too. There's an invite link in the show notes. You can also listen to my other show. It is a top 3 list podcast called A Top 3 Podcast that Chris has been a guest on a particularly chaotic and fun episode. So that show's a good time. It's a comedy show. It's very different from this one. And then last but not least, if you would like to support the show monetarily, you can do that at patreon.com/realdavejackson. Every month I run polls for a game that I'll cover on the show. You can vote. You can get bonus episodes. I have a bonus retro gaming series called Tales from the Way Backlog that Final Fantasy IV is old enough for, but made it on the main show. But there's a lot of, over a year of those monthly episodes at this point. So that is a lot of talk about me. I'm going to catch my breath. We're going to listen to a bit of music, and when we come back, it's full spoiler time for Final Fantasy IV. All right, we're back, and it's full spoiler time for Final Fantasy IV. And as always, it's not going to necessarily be a chronological walk through the story. So this is like, the spoilers are free to fly however they may come out. So again, if you don't want to be spoiled, please put this podcast down, back slowly away from the podcast, and go play the game or something like that and come back. So let's start with the most famous thing about the story. Happens fairly early on in the story, and it is the change that Cecil undergoes. And so you start out the story, Cecil is a Dark Knight. We said he's done some evil shit. I got the impression that that was part of the deal of being a Dark Knight, was you're going to go out and do some evil shit. Is that right?
Or you just, in the Final Fantasy series, Final Fantasy 3, where I think it was the first time it's introduced, you just change your character to it, and that's all there is to it. I mean, like, you get a cool little sprite, but that's apparently what it is that they use the power of darkness in order to, whatever that may be, in order to gain power and strength. It's very much focused on physical strength, physical ability, in order to become more powerful. And that's what I inferred from certain parts of the plot. Jenny, I know you're more keyed into that than probably I am. So specifically, like, is that pretty much what's happening?
Yeah, so I interpreted his darkness ability is that because in some versions of the game, you hurt yourself in order to produce the skill. So I always interpreted that as like a self-harm thing, that you have to kind of hate yourself in order to produce this darkness. And that's kind of where Cecil's power comes from, is that his self-hatred, and that the king encouraged him to go into this skill, this power, and use it. Whereas like the King of Fabul tells him, you can't beat evil with darkness, no matter how powerful your darkness is. And I think that's kind of a interesting theme throughout the whole story. We get it with Cecil in the beginning. We get it with Tella. We get it with Rydia in the beginning too. We get it with Edge, where, these really powerful, detrimental emotions that are really negative emotions create power, but how stable is that power?
Mm-hmm. And it was like the main thing that I took away from the game, from like a thematic perspective, is this theme of redemption that so many characters go through as well. And Cecil's the first one. And then we move on to other characters kind of redeeming their past acts, or trying to. Some of them are incomplete when the game ends, which I think is nice. Yeah. But with Cecil, what happens is, eventually he realizes, he's been tricked. This whole thing is a sham, and he does not like the things that he's done, probably doesn't like the fact that the darkness ability, the source of his power, hurts him, which I thought that was another awesome thing. It's in the PSP version, another one of those things where gameplay mechanics reinforce what's going on in the story with the characters. So he goes on a pilgrimage up Mount Ordeals, renounces his old ways, and becomes a paladin. And again, the changing of a character class is a major story moment. I knew about this before playing this, and I think that it's not necessarily like a giant spoiler at this point. 20 plus years later, 30 plus years later, math is rough at an hour and 20 into a podcast.
I wish it was 20 years later.
Yeah.
Me too. I'm getting older just listening.
What was surprising to me is like how quickly this happens. I knew this was a thing in the game. I knew, okay, at some point Cecil's going to turn into a paladin. It's going to be this big story moment. He is, overcoming the evil things he's done in his past and forgiving himself and things like that. And he's starting on this new journey. And I was like, okay, this is going to happen at hour 20. No, it's like hour 3. It's very early in the story. And that was very surprising to me.
But going back to what I alluded to in the non-spoiler section, if you sit down, you start talking about it, I think even people who played it and got done with the game and they're trying to talk about it again, just kind of review their experience with the game. I think most people on their initial playthrough, if they're not paying attention to the clock or anything like that, be like, yeah, that happened like 6 hours in. That's when that happened. And then you have to tell them, no, that was 2.5. That's how much stuff is packed in to that 2.5 hours. And it feels natural. And it's also probably one of the coolest moments because you have to go into a battle against yourself in order to cement that class change. And the way you cement it is through atonement. It's not through aggression. And that is a very unique way of having player input affect the character's journey, which is something you typically don't have in very story-based games. Or even like games in general. If things change, the game just kind of does it for you. And the game is like, no, you have to, this is Cecil's journey and you are Cecil. So what does Cecil have to do? And I think that's extremely cool. Like if you, the player, are getting it, then it makes that moment even more special.
Yeah, I thought that not completely wiping the slate clean and being like, oh, he's a paladin, we're starting all over, you know, none of the past stuff matters anymore, that he has to, you know, defeat his past by accepting it, by acknowledging, yes, I did these things and I'm capable of doing these things, but I'm not going to be that person anymore. And I think it's such an interesting mechanic that when you fight the Dark Knight version of yourself at Mount Ordeals, you know, you don't win, like you said, by aggression, you just wait it out and the Dark Knight defeats himself using darkness because that's taking away at his HP. And I thought that was such a fun, like interesting, really thoughtful mechanic about how, you know, you can't just pretend all of those bad things didn't happen or that it doesn't matter because you didn't do them anymore. You know, you're not doing them anymore. It matters because you did do them. So you have to accept that past version of yourself.
And in the Super Nintendo version, unfortunately, you may not get that because Dark Knight Cecil doesn't have the darkness ability. So you would never know that what he was doing might be causing him to lose hit points. You're just like, what's this wave attack that keeps coming at me? I don't know what this is. But yeah, that's the one thing that's interesting that I picked up on is once the battle is over, Cecil doesn't hate his past self. It's more of an acknowledgement. He's not disowning it. Much like Jenny says, he's recognizing what he is. It's not a denial. It's not a removal. It's not an abandonment. It's like, this is me. This is who I am. And this is who I want to be. But you're still me, which is also, I think, a stroke of brilliant writing.
Yeah. So I don't mean to jump too far ahead and like leave this conversation entirely. But there is a prophecy that's brought up later in the game where they talk about one who is of both darkness and light. And that's Cecil, right?
He brought balance to the Force.
He did. Yeah, he did. Exactly. But so it's just like the two of you were saying, like one who is of both darkness and light, that darkness is still a part of him, even though he went through this change. And I thought one thing that was cool, another of these gamifying story moments, gamifying is the wrong word, but reinforcing it with RPG mechanics is when he becomes a paladin, he starts at level 1 again. So it shows you, because you were maybe level 15 or something like that when you did this. It shows you, the player, like, oh, okay, we have a long journey ahead of Cecil on this new path that he's walking. So this was really good, and it's like emblematic of that thing I talked about earlier, where if this story were told in a new game in 2001, this would probably happen later in the game. Or this would take longer to like go through this process. It would not happen at hour 2.5 or hour 3. It would be a longer ordeal that Cecil would go through. There would be maybe more self-loathing before this. And this is what I meant when I was talking about how a lot more is put on you, the player, to be like, yes, this is what's going on, because you don't really get a window into Cecil's mind that often in the whole game in general. But this is one of like the major things with him, where it's just like, okay, I see what they're doing here, and I see how it would be different if this game came out 10 years later, and how the storytelling approach would be a little bit different. As it is, it moves by really quickly, and it is like sometimes brought up later on in the story, but then you're on to other people's things, and you're on to rescuing Rosa, and then you're on to going after Golbez and going to the moon, and there isn't really time to reflect on this stuff.
So
this is Yeah.
I would say that's kind of a negative here, is that Cecil's development pretty much ends after the transformation. There are plot revelations that involve him, like him being Golbez's brother, him being an alien, technically. Like, these things are revealed to the player, but in terms of his actual development, it pretty much ceases at this point.
Yeah, I wish they had spent a little bit more time with him, like dealing with his past after becoming a paladin, and that he's still struggling with it. I think that would have been a really great addition to the story, but that's what fan fiction's for, I guess.
Exactly.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. I think that part of it, like, you can infer some of that when you start to see, when you learn about his relationship with Golbez and you see how he reacts to learning that Golbez is his brother. Like, it very obviously shakes him up, and they don't portray it in a way where you're like, oh yeah, he's really going through it. It's just like, he can't talk about it. Like, he doesn't know how to handle it. And they express that in the game by just giving him the ... speech bubble whenever there's an opportunity to confront it, basically.
And the sad sprite, he looks down.
Yeah. You can put those pieces together in your head. It's just another example of, a later Final Fantasy game would give you entire cutscenes of Cecil going through it.
Well, it's also hard to relate to Cecil in a lot of ways because you don't know how he feels about family in general. You never have heard him mention anything about family or how he feels about family members, be it a mother, father, sister, or a brother throughout the entire game. So when that revelation does come to the forefront, it's like, yeah, he's your brother, but he's been trying to murder you. So, yeah. Why is this important? Like, did you have a brother? Did you lose a brother? Have you lost family members? Have you felt alone your entire life? And these aren't things that I don't feel are fully developed. So if you're going into this and you're like, why would he care that it's his brother just because it's his brother? And maybe that's a cultural difference. I don't think it's that big of a cultural difference because, in most cultures and societies, we have very close familial bonds. But like, that if he's never known he's had any family members his entire life, and that's not expressed at all, the revelation that he had a brother, I don't know why it should assume that should have an immediate impact.
I think the thing that helped with that for me personally was, and this is not told in the game, this is me coming to this on my own, but maybe he sees, once he learns that this is his family, and Golbez is the evil one, the antagonist for 95% of the game, just like most JRPGs and Final Fantasy games do. And Golbez is the evil one. And I think there's even a thing where they say, like, Golbez was chosen because of the darkness inside of him and how easily he would be controlled in this way by the ultimate big bad. And maybe Cecil sees, he has that darkness also, and he sees that in Golbez a little bit. And so maybe that's kind of like the ripping off that scab of like that past life a little bit. But again, you don't get that directly told, or you don't get Cecil thinking about it. You just get, he hangs his head and can't talk whenever there's an opportunity to. So it's on you to do some of that lifting.
I also think the game is more geared towards a younger audience that might have those family members. So them kind of assuming that a younger person or a person with family members would fill in that gap, and that being a big revelation, that could have been a thought process in writing it, which would be understandable. You only have so many bytes of data to fill in plot points, and you still have a 20-hour game on a brand new system. So you might not be able to get into those finer details like you might want to.
Yeah. One thing I do like about like Cecil's characterization after this is that Cecil is not a paladin, therefore perfect after this. He's still like, he makes rash decisions and is going to rush off into danger and disregards what his partner Rosa thinks about a lot of situations, and is just very like, nope, I'm going to do this. I'm in control here. You should do what I say here. I'm going to the fucking moon. You stay behind, stuff like that. So I do like that, even though he switches to a paladin, this holy character class, that doesn't mean that he's all of a sudden this great person. He's still the same person inside.
Yeah, he's still human. Or
sort of.
Lunarian human.
Sort of.
And I think the whole theme of forgiveness comes into play too, because what I think Cecil is struggling with is forgiving Golbez for doing all the terrible things that he did. He was able to forgive Cain twice, and he, in some versions of the game of FF4, they refer to Cain and Cecil as being raised as brothers. So I can see where, having one brother betray you and then finding out that your other brother also betrayed you, I think that's a lot to handle in the moment. And I think with time, and a little bit more time in the game, Cecil would have addressed those feelings. But, him coming around to forgive Golbez is a big ask, with everything that's happened. So I think him just even acknowledging Golbez as his brother in the end is a big step toward that forgiveness for Cecil.
I think there's a lot of that too when you talk about his feelings towards Rosa, because when he was a Dark Knight, he was extremely dismissive of her. You see this in the opening scene, which even when you get to the opening scene, even though Rosa's a high priestess and everything like that, is kind of breaking conventions because it highly suggests, at least outside of the North American Super Nintendo version, that they are actively lovers at the time. So when you see that first scene where he's all mopey and he's down and he's feeling horrible, she's coming in to comfort him, and he's pretty much like, I'll go fuck off. I don't want to deal with you. And so at the end, he is probably feeling that his atonement means that he has to continue to protect her and keep her safe, where she's like, no, I'm here with you, when she goes with him to the moon. I don't necessarily see that as him having a negative character trait, but more coming to terms with himself and what's important in his own life and what those people mean to him in those situations. Because I really do think, same with Rydia, where he failed to protect her, and even though she's become a party member, he still feels like that's owed to her. And Kain is right around with him for the ride, and he's like, well, here's this dumb ninja dude, screw him, he can do whatever. But like, leaving them behind is just, it feels like that's part of his duty and part of his atonement.
I like that scene a lot when Cecil's going to go barge off on his own, and the Rydia and Rosa are like, okay, we're going too. Of course, we're all a group. We're doing this together. And Cecil's like, nope, you're staying here. I'm going by myself. And they're like, yeah, sure. And then they basically trick him into going along with him. I thought that was a great scene, especially because I didn't feel like, especially Rosa had a whole lot of agency as a character up until that point. And then that happened, and I was like, finally, Rosa gets to make a decision. Let's go.
Mm-hmm. Which is not typical in games of this time. It was definitely not. Which was cool. It wasn't anime, but definitely not games.
I was very outraged when he tried to get rid of them. I'm like, those are your support classes. What are you doing? So it was,
exactly.
It was nice to see them get back on.
She's a summoner, dude. Like, she does more damage in combat than you do. Bring her along.
What are you thinking?
The best cure spell you have is Cura, right? Like, that might restore 200 hit points. You have like 2,500. You do the math.
Right.
Yeah. I think this is a good part to just talk about their stories a little bit too. Specifically with Rydia, I thought was a little bit like too quick to forgive Cecil and just like join up on the plan a little bit. And again, it's one of those things that I feel like a broken record saying it, but if this game came out in 2001, you might get more of, her side of things and why she is so quick to join up. And like at the beginning, she's a little kid. She can't live by herself. So she kind of reluctantly goes along. And Cecil is definitely trying to like atone for what he did to her family and her hometown and things like that. It just felt like it was a little bit quick where she was like down with Cecil as a person after everything that he did. And there wasn't really any part where like she makes him fully confront what he did to her and how he like, ruined her life basically. Happened pretty quickly. And then like for the rest of the game, she's she's out of the party for a little while, but even before that, she seems to be on board with the plans.
I think early Rydia's development is kind of bad. I'll admit that. I mean, did Cecil ruin her life? Technically, yes. Was it really Cecil? No, it was more the king, and he was just following orders. He didn't know he was going to blow up a town. And an adult Rydia would understand that, but a 6-year-old Rydia, you just killed my mother, didn't know that it was her mother. They just had to get to the next point. Like, this isn't personal. It's just business. And then getting to the town, like, let's drop off this package. Oh no, blows up the town. Bad times. So like adult Rydia would probably understand that. A kid's not going to understand that. Not going to have that perspective at all. Like whatsoever. So just for her to turn on a dime once he saves her from 3 soldiers barging in and says, let's take the girl. Like, it's kind of like she's kind of in a hard place. Like no matter what, she's kind of screwed over. So for her to just trust Cecil implicitly, yeah, told you I'd swap.
You made up a hidden third pronunciation.
Yeah, Cecil. I'll come up see if I can get more. But her to just turn on a dime like that doesn't make a whole lot of sense. And I can see that being a legitimate criticism if you really want to dive into the narrative, which is fair. And the other part is when she just like, hey, we need to learn fire, and she's like, I don't want to, but you should. Okay, fire. I think that was a little off-putting because of just the immediacy of what she just says. Yeah, it's fine. I can learn how to burn things now, even though I have massive PTSD, but I'll just overcome that in the span of 30 seconds.
Yeah.
I think a lot could be said about the tunnel vision also applying to child Rydia in this situation where there's a goal and there's a task, and it's a bit easier for her to blame Golbez and be like, Golbez did this, he did this, to my family, to my village. And it's a bit easier, not necessarily to forgive Cecil right away, but to accept that, she's going on his journey with him to stop who really did this. So I think as a child, that's really easy for her to kind of like convince herself. And then, she grows up in the Feymarch, time passes, she has time in her entire childhood to kind of process what happened to her. So I think that her rejoining the party really, really, whether she outright says, I forgive you, Cecil, which she doesn't in the game. And I feel like if she did, we would have seen it, as part of the gameplay. But I think that's something that she did for herself, that she, had to forgive Cecil in order to move on with what she needed to do, and which is to stop Golbez.
I mean, in a way, she does by saving the party at that moment. Which is an amazing scene. One of the best scenes in the entire game. I think it is the best scene in the entire game. How it's scripted. Oh, it's so good. But with the way she does it and the fact that she does it with the Mist Dragon, I think that, to me, that says, I forgive you, but we got to kick this dude's ass. Like, that's the most important thing right now. It's such a good scene.
I got to ask, in the PSP version, when Golbez is defeated and he goes and gets the crystal anyway, does he turn into a hand and like crawl over, or does he just like mysteriously like grab it and go?
I think he turns into a hand.
Yes, it's like the best part. Yeah. It's so ridiculous and it's weird. So silly, but I love that.
And they all just watch it.
The newer versions.
Yeah. It's not like,
it's ridiculous.
It's like, Dude, you're a paladin. Go stab that fucking thing. Right? Like, come on.
They changed it in some of the later versions, but the hand version is just the best.
It's just like crawling along.
Yeah, it's like a Zelda enemy. Yeah.
I want to see Square animate that just so I can get an explanation why everyone was just like, it's a hand. Should we stop that? I want to see what it does. Oh, it's running away.
Yeah. Oh, it grabbed the crystal and it's leaving. Okay, whoops. Glad we got to see it, though. Yeah. Final Fantasy IV remake. Let's greenlight it just so we can see this in photorealistic 3D. I think that like what the both of you were talking about with like the different ways that you can read how Rydia processes all of this and, you know, comes to at least a state where maybe she does or doesn't forgive Cecil, but she definitely joins up on the quest. Even she could have just stayed there and not joined them. She made the decision to join them. She made the decision to follow him to the moon and all of that. Like, I think that both of these reads are possible because the game doesn't tell you any of that. You are just left to kind of fill in those blanks by yourself, which, you know, could be good, could leave you wanting just a little bit more to, you know, want the creator to just be like, to just tell me like, yo, how does she feel about Cecil? And you don't really get that other than she's down to take down Golbez, which is fair enough. And forgiveness is a thing that a lot of characters have to grapple with throughout the entire story. And it's kind of messy for a lot of the characters here to deal with too. It's not like just a series of people forgiving each other. It's a series of people with really complicated situations, and some forgive the others and some of them don't. And I think that that's good at the very least. Speaking of forgiveness, we have not talked much about Kyne, but the reason that he did not factor into a lot of the discussion, you know, in these other character stories, and especially the first half of the game, is because he's gone after that earthquake in the Mist Village, I think it's called. He's separated from Cecil, and then he comes back as a crony of Golbez. So he betrays you multiple times in the game. He's constantly in and out of the party, not in the way that other characters do, but in the way that he joins, you forgive him, all is well, then he betrays you, he leaves, then he comes back, he joins, all is well. And it's this repeated thing. And you end up finding out that it's because he's been mind controlled by Golbez for the early duration, at least maybe like the first half, until they hit Golbez with the meteor and it breaks it. And what I like about this is the characters are pretty quick to forgive Kyne. Cecil especially is like, no, you're my brother, come back. I love you, come back. Kyne never forgives himself. And this is something that continues throughout the entire game. And one of the last scenes of the game is him going to Mount Ordeals to try to work on himself. So like, this is unresolved on purpose. And that's something I really like, is that we have a lot of games. We will praise a lot of games for neatly wrapping up every single storyline before the end. And this one is not. It's left unfinished on purpose. Does this continue in the after years, Jenny?
It does, but I wasn't super satisfied with where it went.
Okay, fair enough. But so just for this game, Final Fantasy IV, I really liked how we go on this journey. Some characters are quick to forgive, but then Kyne is the one who's not ready to forgive himself. Even after you take down the big bad and all of that, he's still got to go work on himself. And I thought this was really good.
Yeah, so much to the point, and that's important because that's the wedding between Cecil and Rosa. And it's more explained that not only is he working on himself, he is so beset by the actions that transpire through the game, he doesn't feel like he can show his face around them. Like, that's how down and out he is about himself. Even though everyone's more than willing to accept him, that lack of self-forgiveness or lack of self-acceptance, something that Cecil was able to do. Because not only are they brothers, they are rivals, like friendly rivals, which is the reason that Golbez can drive that wedge. So, like, Cecil can overcome himself, his darkness, his darker side. I need to do the same, and I wasn't able to do that, which almost caused everything to be in ruin. So, yeah, that's really an aspect of the ending that I don't know why it just clicked so well until now, even though I've seen it a million times. But Yeah, that's a very important part of Kane's arc. I just said Kane. That's a very important part of Kane's arc.
1 point for Jenny.
Damn.
And I think a detail to keep in mind is that Kane does admit that he had some autonomy over what he was doing while being mind controlled, and that he was prompted because he wanted to keep Rosa nearby, that he has feelings for her and he's jealous of Cecil, and all these things were inspiring him to do these horrible things. So I think that struggle with knowing that he wanted to do some of the things that he did, or all of the things that he did, is a big thing that he needs to forgive himself for. Having those impulses, we all have those impulses, but acting on them is the important part. And Kane needs to learn not to, act on those now that Golbez isn't controlling him anymore, presumably.
Yeah.
Now, I do have a question for you, Jenny, because you're very seeped in the lore. I've always heard the description between Cecil, Rosa, and Kine being a love triangle. I always seen it more of Kine being a creeper, because in the game, Rosa's, it's like unrequited love. Like, she is just like, hey, you're cool. You're like my boyfriend's friend. You're awesome. It's cool. We can hang out every once in a while. And he's just like, just sitting. And it's kind of like that. That's how I see it.
Well, my ongoing theory on Kane is that he's a very confused bisexual boy, and he likes both Cecil and Rosa, and he's very confused by the whole thing. So that's where I come from with it. So he doesn't quite know what to do. So that's where the love triangle for me comes in, is that it's kind of on all sides. So
I see. I'm kind of surprised to hear you say that people describe it as a love triangle, Chris, because I got the same feeling that you did, is that Cecil and Rosa are very clearly a couple, and then Kine is just on the outside of that, wishing that he were in Cecil's place.
I actually like Jenny's theory more, where sometimes it feels like Kine wants to be in Rosa's place. There's a lot of those vibes too.
And there's a lot of like, does Kane want Rosa because he wants Rosa, or does he want her because she is Cecil's possession and he wants the things that Cecil has? So that's a lot of does he really have feelings for her, or is it something else? Is it inspired by something else?
Yeah, certainly interesting to think about there. Let's see, other characters. So, all right. So the other characters to talk about, I had Edge with his own section, although I'm not sure he deserves his own section. Edge is a fun character. And his whole thing is that he's a prince, and he's kind of like just trying to avoid his duty as a prince, just trying to have good times, I guess, and just not have the responsibility and things like that. So he is, part of his arc is, I guess, just accepting that responsibility. But this is a lot of me assuming things, because you kind of learn a little bit about Edge when he joins the party. Then he's in the party, and he's just a guy in the party for most of the game. And then at the end, it's like Edge went back to the throne. And I was like, oh yeah, that's right. He was, he's royal family. Cool.
Prince of Eblon.
And then, like Chris said earlier, his main contribution to the party throughout most of the game is dying in combat.
Which is it sucks so much. Because if you look at what ninjas do in Final Fantasy III, being dual welding superclass, and now I could imagine if you're like a Japanese child in 1990, I think it came out 1990, whatever, when it came out in Japan, because it always comes out earlier, when it comes out first, and you're like, oh wow, I'm getting a ninja in my party, just like I played on the Famicom and how powerful they are, and it's like, you died by Lamia critical hit. That you're like, oh,
ninjas are kind of lame.
Yeah, he kind of sucks.
So low,
Yeah, it's ridiculous. And he has no armor, and he can't attack from the back row unless he has certain weapons.
Yep.
He can throw, which is only worthwhile if you know how to do the item duplication, which went away in more modern versions. So you can't duplicate all your spoons and Excaliburs, which kind of sucks. But man, I think he's written very well at the beginning. I think there's a ton of potential, because you could make the argument that his happy-go-lucky, plucky style is just a defense mechanism for what happened to his parents, which is a very brutal battle that you have to go through. And then after that, his arc is over almost immediately as you get him. It's just open and done. Closed. That's it. Which, yeah, it's really unfortunate because he's the last party member of your main party that goes and defeats the final boss. And it feels like a wasted slot. I would much rather have the Bart come back.
Yeah, I feel like Edge was unfortunately a lot of wasted potential there. You know, you had such a great opening with his parents and that fight and how awful it was. And, you know, you get Edge becoming more of his character there, but you're right, it just drops off after that. And it's really unfortunate because they could have done a lot with his character. Yeah,
he was one that I had like circled as underdeveloped and would be more explored. Again, if this game were longer, maybe they would have given more time to what's going on in Edge's head. And it's notable with him because he's with you for almost the whole game, or like the majority of the game. He's one of the characters that's with you the longest, we'll say. And so you get a whole lot of like Edge is just with you. He's there. And we'll try to remember what his story was 15 hours later. The other characters...
He has a crush on Rydia.
Kid Rydia or adult Rydia?
He doesn't meet Kid Rydia. It's adult Rydia.
Okay, I was going to say. I was like trying to put the timeline together in my head. Yeah. So the other characters, I think we mentioned this earlier. I think this is what we were referring to. But this game has a bunch of other characters that join the party for a short period of time and then sacrifice themselves in dramatic fashion. And then very like, what's the word? I can't think of the word. It kind of like cuts the impact of their sacrifice because they all come back later magically.
Like
except
a law
for
of diminishing returns.
Yeah.
There we go. We have another law. By
Yes.
like the fifth character sacrifice, you throw up your hands and you're like, come on, like, can someone get stabbed or something like that? So we have Palom and Porum, the Black Mage twins. They sacrifice themselves by turning themselves into stone to stop a Star Wars wall crushing scenario. Tella sacrifices himself by using the last of his strength, because he's an old man, to summon the meteor spell, and he actually dies. He's the only one who doesn't come back. Yang sacrifices himself to turn off some controls in a control room. That one was very dumb as a sacrifice.
Yeah,
I thought. And another character that I don't know, I played the whole game. I don't know anything about that character. He's just kind of like martial arts guy. Monk shows up.
Chu.
Yeah.
He carries your party through the magnetic cave. You know, he that's all he really does.
Yeah. So he sacrifices himself. Sid sacrifices himself by jumping off of the airship with a bomb at some point. And then every character is generally fine. And I think I brought this up in our group chat. I was like, is anyone going to like acknowledge the fact that 5 people have sacrificed themselves? And then finally they do later on. Cecil references it. And later on, Edge is about to do it. And Rydia stops him, is like, hey, enough with the sacrifices. Nobody else, okay? You're staying right here. But it's kind of comical how many people do this throughout the game.
They kind of make a reference to that when you find Sid after he supposedly blows himself up.
Yeah.
And then you go see him and like, oh, he's alive. He's in bed. We found him, which is like the second time that happened, because the first time is with Edward. Now, Edward didn't sacrifice himself. He just got thrown off a boat and everyone thought he was eaten by Leviathan. But you find him and like, oh, he's alive. And then you find Sid and it's like, oh, he's alive. And then he works really hard on your airship to make it fire retardant. And then all of a sudden they're like, oh, he worked himself to death. Sid, are you awake? And it starts playing the sad music and you see the Z's over his head and like, oh yeah, he's alive. And it's like, okay, so the game is having a laugh at it that they're kind of all coming back. But I wonder, I would love to see if this was ever in any interview. I haven't looked it up, or if anyone's ever asked Sakaguchi or anyone on that staff why that was the way it was. But I wonder if they were toning it down, because in Final Fantasy 2 and Final Fantasy 3, like, your party members are dying like it's going out of style. Like, that they would do the same thing. Have you played Final Fantasy 2, Dave?
No.
So is it okay if I give like slight spoilers for 2 here, or is that because it's a different game I should avoid that?
Yeah, go ahead. I'll cut it if I don't want it.
So in Final Fantasy 2, you start out with 3 party members. You get to name 4, but the 4th one just goes away. He's just disappears, kind of like Kain does. And throughout the game, you get a character to fill that 4th party slot throughout the entirety of it. But almost every single time, I think with the exception of one character, when that character leaves your party, they die or sacrifice themselves or something. Like, that's the answer. That's the solution. And they're not like Final Fantasy IV dead. They are dead. Like, gone.
They're the drummer for Spinal Tap. They've been through like 17 fourth members in the party.
That's Final Fantasy II. And 3 does some similar stuff. In fact, what is it? The fun thing about Final Fantasy II is that Kain's father is technically in it, if you want to get down into that lore. Also dies.
Of course, yeah.
But yeah, it's so comical. Like, and the fact that Tell is the only one who dies, and he's not one who has anything really happen to him on his death. It's just because he summoned Meteor. That's why he dies, not because he blew himself up or anything like that. It's fun.
On Tella's death, I thought it was really like kind of hypocritical, because, you know, the whole arc with Tella is that he's bent on vengeance, and he needs to, you know, destroy Golbez for what he did, and he sacrifices himself for that. And as he's dying, Cecil says to him, we'll avenge you and your daughter. And I always thought that was a little tone deaf given what happened. You know, the whole point of Tella's arc is that, you know, you can't do eye for an eye, you can't do tit for tat, because, you know, everyone, you'll destroy yourself in the end. And for Cecil to come around and be like, oh yeah, we'll avenge you, I was just like, oh, that's the wrong thing to say right now. But I always thought that was a little off in the script.
Could be a situation where like maybe it's off in the script, or maybe it's just Cecil being tone deaf in the moment.
Yeah.
Which is, you know, he's not necessarily like the most emotionally intelligent character we've established.
Yes. I don't think that was intentional, though. I think that was probably an oversight, I would imagine.
Big dramatic moment. We will avenge you.
But I will say, for the sacrifices, the first 2 actually started to impact me as I got older. When I was younger, like, when you're a kid, these things don't really emotionally impact you whatsoever.
Right.
But especially as I start getting older and having kids as myself, and seeing Palom and Porum, who were kids, being like, we'll be the ones who sacrifice ourselves, and just the adults just incapable of doing anything. Here are these 2 kids, and they mention that, and that's in the script. Like, it should have been me. Why did you throw your life away? That got me a little bit much later in life. So did Tella's death. And like, it's all that pain, all that anguish. And it's like, I have to stop you. This is bigger than me, even though it is me. Mm-hmm. But by the time you get to young, it's like,
yeah, it's a bit much.
I don't care. I still don't care. Like,
yeah,
you're an idiot. Like, what are you doing?
And then when Sid does it, I literally I was like, okay, here we go again. You know, there's no impact to Sid doing it at all. And Sid is, of those characters, Sid is one of the more likable ones for sure. So it was like, sucked to see him leave, but like you said, law of diminishing returns. You have a limit for how many characters can sacrifice themselves before it doesn't mean anything anymore.
You should have given him a fish before he jumped.
Yeah. A good fish, a strong, healthy fish.
That's why he lived, is he had the right fish.
There we go. Yeah, he had a nice fish in his back pocket when he jumped off. I did like, you know, just as I started to be like, this is fucking ridiculous, I did like how Rydia and Cecil like comment on it, and especially Rydia's part where she was like, no one else is sacrificing themselves. Like, there are better ways to do this. Edge, sit the fuck down. We're going to do this a different way. So I thought it was like, okay, finally, maybe that was the writers being in on the joke a little bit too, and just being like, okay, wink, wink, nudge, nudge, no more sacrificing from here on out, perhaps. I think we covered a lot of the stuff about Golbez and Cecil's relationship, but the one thing that we didn't yet talk about in detail is who the actual big bad is. And this is like the classic, maybe it is the beginning of the trope, like you both talked about earlier today, but the classic JRPG trope of you have a villain throughout 95, maybe 99% of the game. And then that turns out to not be the real villain. And you just have an ultimate big bad. And we just keep increasing the scope higher and higher until it cannot be increased anymore and you're fighting God at the end of the game. This game does that too, where Golbez is the villain for the entire game. And I was like, okay, precursor to Kefka. Let's go. But unlike Final Fantasy VI, Golbez was himself being mind controlled by an entity called Zemus or Zemus. I don't know. I'm going to call it Zemus because Zemus does not roll off the tongue. But Zemus is an ancient evil, lives on the moon, I believe, or at least wants the moon for power that lies there. We go to the moon, if we haven't said that already. I think we did, but I knew that about Final Fantasy IV also. Just, hey, fun fact about Final Fantasy IV, you go to the moon at some point. So that was fun. But Zemus is this like new big bad that gets introduced later on. And while I don't like this trope, I do at least think that it's interesting that you do get the angle that Golbez is being mind controlled and he's related to Cecil. And now Cecil and Golbez have to deal with this. It's not like, in my opinion, Final Fantasy IX, where the final boss comes out of fucking nowhere and I'm fighting it. I'm like, why am I fighting this thing? At least it's not that, but it is that trope. It's here.
Yeah, and Zemus isn't really the final boss either because he has a higher form of being called Zeromus.
Right. That's right, yeah.
Find out right before. I don't like it either, to be honest with you. I do like the character design. I think it looks awesome.
Oh,
I do like the
on
fight.
The PSP? Hell fucking yeah.
Oh, yeah. Conceptually, I think it does give a good out for Cecil with Golbez and how that all relates. I think there's a lot there. I think it's a little underdeveloped. I think that would be fair to say. But I think that if there was a revelation that he was his brother a lot earlier, that's kind of like the out. And I think it's a good out. And I think that fulfills its duty. So while I don't like the trope, I don't like the enemy out of a magic rabbit hat, or rabbit out of a, I meant. But like, I'm not a big fan of that. I could see what they were trying to do, and I don't know if they did that in Final Fantasy III, mostly because it's like a dark cloud or a dark force or something like that was the final boss. It's dumb. I can't even remember. It's like the worst villain in Final Fantasy history. But I think that also comes out like near the end. And I think it's done a lot better here, to that credit. I also think it's done way better than it was done in Final Fantasy IX, for that matter as well. So I'm not going to hate on it too much. It creates a fun fight. It creates an interesting battle. And it does give the player an opportunity to fight against pure evil, just unbridled evil, as opposed to something that may have any nuance whatsoever.
Yeah, that higher form, Zeromus, is described as the hatred of Zemus, now given physical form, which is as JRPG as it gets.
Yes.
I think the coolest thing about Zemus overall is that, and I don't know if this is in the other versions, but in some versions it's revealed that he's a Lunarian as well, just like Kluya and Fusoya. So it's interesting to see that the Lunarians are able to channel their negative emotions into something like that. And we see where Golbez and Cecil almost went if they hadn't, been stopped or chose to do a different path where they could have gone, with that using your hatred for power. And I think that's kind of the end of the ending of the theme of unstable power and like raw emotions being used for, like raw negative emotions. And that's how you're able to defeat him in the end, is because that kind of power isn't sustainable. But I like the addition that he's a Lunarian too.
Yeah. And I think one thing that could be brought back to criticize, like, my critique, because the beginning of this episode I said, hey, everything that happens with Cecil is really well paced and it happens within like an hour and a half, 2 hours. And then I'm like, oh, at the end, it feels like it comes out of nowhere, even though it comes like an hour and a half, 2 hours before the end. And this is like that minor critique I had of the pacing, where there's just this big gap in between that really compact pacing at the beginning and some inconsistent pacing once you get underground and that starts and you have a lot of dead time to go do this all exploration, that when it comes to the end, that ending does feel really compact and rushed, as opposed to the beginning where it feels like it's a elongated, very nicely paced thing. It just feels like, slam, we got to get to the end. We're putting in a bunch of crap all at once, even though they're roughly the same amount of time and length.
Yeah, I think that like that feeling of it feeling rushed comes from, like you said, you go a long time without Cecil really not without him doing anything, because he does a lot of stuff, but there's not a lot of growth along the way. And then, so you're dealing with other characters and their stuff. And then you get to the end and then it's like, okay, it's Cecil time again. We're rushing through this with Golbez, and they're going to try and like come to grips with their relationship and who they are. And then you have this ultimate big bad. You're on the moon. You've got this like race of beings that live on the moon. Cecil's one of them. Golbez also one of them.
Also naming ways.
Yeah. There's an entire cave full of them, which is great. So there is like a lot of stuff that's thrown at you while you're on the moon, but your time spent on the moon is mostly going through the dungeon, and then like story stuff all happens pretty quickly. So I definitely get that, like that kind of rushed feeling from it. Though I did like I thought that this wrapped up pretty neatly with this. I did like the revelation with Golbez and Cecil. I liked not necessarily that Zemus came out at the end, but if Zemus is there, I like the rationale for what it is and what's going on there and how it relates to the other characters.
Agreed.
And then I do like, I think, Jenny, you said this, like part of the way that you defeat Zeromus at the end is not because you know the ultimate spell. It's not that you are over leveled and you're just going to like whip its ass with 9999 damage every single time. There is a different process for how you actually defeat this hatred given physical form. And it's not, it kind of, again, with Cecil's change to a paladin, it's not through pure force on your end. It's, the people on Earth pray, they send their strength to Cecil at the end. I thought this was great. It's like the Final Fantasy theme is playing. People are sending their energy to help out. I thought this was really good. Like the way this all comes together at the end, I'm a fan.
Did Earthbound steal this?
They may have. A little bit more involvement on your part as a player in Earthbound at the end. But yeah.
Yeah, Earthbound, I'm not taking anything away from Earthbound's ending. I think Earthbound's ending is fantastic, but it has a lot of those vibes, and I think it's just as good. You get to see Tella again, who's with Fusoya for some reason, even though Fusoya is definitely not dead, but they come to say hi to you, to give you that power. And yeah, it's really cool. I already said that. I love the battle, and I agree with you. The rationale is more than good enough to, avoid the fact that magical enemy appears. I think that they deliver on that.
Yeah. And just like the process that you go through at the end where like Zeromus is kicking the party's ass, but it's the prayers and support from because like we talked about the rotating cast and how you're locked into your party for most of the game, but it's not like that at the end. You get access to basically everybody because they didn't all die. So you can choose who to take, and the people that you leave behind on Earth are sending their support via prayer. And while the boss is kicking your ass, their support is what revives the party and heals you and stuff as this is going on.
Can you do that in the PSP version before you beat the game?
Yes.
Oh.
Yeah, you can pick who's in your party at the end. I picked the canon party, but yeah, you don't have to take you don't have a set lineup.
I think the GBA version does the same thing, but I'm not positive.
I think you have to beat the game first in the GBA version,
Okay.
because I have done that. But in the GBA version, I think I could be wrong, because I know you can pick party members at some point, but you have to beat it with the canon party first.
Oh, interesting. Not in the PSP, but I went canon anyway.
Yeah.
So I was gonna be like, who'd you take in the final dungeon? But apparently, it's not an option in all the games. But yeah, Rydia, Cecil, Rosa, Edge, and Kyne for me in the final dungeon, just because they were the best.
Apparently, Edward has the highest base stats, by the way.
Good for Edward. I'm very happy to hear that. I was going to say, like, so Edward is going to be like the Kamari or like the, I don't know, what's the mimic guy from Final Fantasy VI?
Go.
Yeah.
Okay.
So Edward is going to be like the one that like the expert players are like, nah, actually you can beat the whole game with Edward if you just put in the time.
Never sleep on a bard, man. Never
true.
sleep on the bard.
So the final conclusion for like this theme of the darkness within you and I guess like living with that, as Cecil went through that earlier, is Zeromus gives a kind of like JRPG villain speech at the end, talking about how, you know, humans will never be, pure and good. I will always exist as long as there's darkness within humans, yada, yada, yada. Again, trope.
Yes.
But maybe very early on in the history of that trope. So that's here. It's kind of like being introduced to a band, like a new band via its greatest hits album. It's like if someone were to play this as their first JRPG. So the finale is that after defeating Zeromus, Golbez goes with Fusoya to go sleep and pray for the future of Earth because it's assumed that Zeromus will be back in some form or fashion at some point. And so they're going to need the support. And Golbez and Cecil have their farewell. Again, because it's Final Fantasy IV, it's very short, but it is there. They do make a very quick peace with the fact that they are who they are. And then Golbez leaves. And it's another step on characters going through their redemption arcs. Cecil went through it. Golbez has now taken a big step, if not completed that. And then we already talked about Kyne is still working on it after the game ends. So I like how we have this very clear theme of redemption. We see it through multiple characters. Multiple characters go through it at different times. One of them is unresolved, still working on it. It's very good from that perspective.
By the way, I'm going to correct myself because I just thought of something. Fusoya does not show up with Tella. He shows up with Golbez. Edward shows up with Tella. Sorry, at that final scene, before anyone has to correct anything. By the way, I think this is one of the best endings in the Final Fantasy games. It just wraps up. It wraps up. It's one of those happy-go-lucky ones, but it's not 100% happy-go-lucky. You know that Golbez is now your brother, and you're coming to terms with that. You're accepting that, and he's gone. Like the moon goes away to go do whatever they do on moon
forgot about
things.
that. Yeah,
because they have now it went from 2 moons to 1 moon. So now it's more like the Earth, which the Earth looks like from space, looks like the Earth, even though your map doesn't. Go figure. But moon is gone. Kyne isn't going to come back and say hi to you. You do have, dead Tella, but everything else is just like, where else do you go with that ending? I think it just ends exactly how it should. It doesn't really try to open up any other angles for like a trilogy or like a sequel where people have to go find their dead boyfriend or something. I don't know. It ends up perfectly fine. Wraps up very nicely.
Yeah, I thought it didn't need a sequel. I was really surprised when it did get a sequel and how unsatisfying it was. But like in general, it wraps up really neatly for the most part. And the stuff that doesn't wrap up, it shouldn't be. You know, it's not resolved yet.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Interesting that you say that, well, both of you say that you're very happy with how it wraps up very neatly. And then Jenny, you said that the sequel was unsatisfying. And I wonder why. They just didn't have a whole lot of loose story threads to work with here. So.
Yeah, I wasn't a big fan. I mean, other people really enjoyed it, and I've heard good things, but I just didn't like what I played.
That's fair. Yeah. The ending has a little montage, very like Legend of Zelda type montage, going through all the characters. And from what this is my first experience with this kind of ending, the Ocarina of Time. Let's revisit everybody, see what they're up to now. So Palom and Porom are back studying in Mysidia, how to be better mages. Edge is trying to settle down. Rydia goes back to the Fey March and is going to live her life there. Yang is back home with his wife. Fun little side quest that you can go on with him and his wife, where she gets you to smack him with a pan, I think, to wake him up. So good dynamic for the married couple there. Edward wrote a song for Cecil, a paladin song. Cecil and Rosa get married. They're now king and queen. And like we said before, Kyne goes off to go work on himself to go face Mount Ordeals. And what I didn't mention, and I forgot until I got to this part of the notes, he has long blonde hair now for some reason, at least in the PSP version.
Well, his hair is always covered up by his helmet.
Did he always have long, lush blonde hair?
Absolutely did. He is a pretty boy.
He's a very pretty boy. In the DS version, you can see his ponytail. His like long blonde ponytail.
Fair enough. I thought it was going to be like I don't know. So just some kind of like, this is me and my new haircut, and I'm off to go become a new person or something like that. So the last thing in the game is they see the moon pass by, and Cecil thinks he hears his brother's voice say farewell. And that is the end of Final Fantasy IV. And I do really like the ending. I like how the storylines wrap up, and the most important storylines, and I guess kind of like the more emotional themes, I think, do get a lot of exploration with the ending. And I think that that's quite good. So for all of the times when I thought that things were underexplored or went by too quickly, they did make a point to hit those themes at the end with the final boss and what the characters are going through. And I thought that was really nice.
Yeah, I've already said, wraps up neatly.
Yep.
Unfortunately, Rydia ends up with Edge. Poor Rydia. But what are you going to do?
Rough.
Does she? I mean, he flirts with her, or he tries to talk to her, but in the wedding scene. But that's about it.
Even Leviathan and Asura are trying to push her that way. So it's kind of like, hey, I mean, you hung out here, but you're not really a summoned monster. So yeah, it's been nice, but yeah, go out of your nest a little bit, have some fun.
Well, and there's the whole thing about time moving faster in the Fey March, so we don't know like if she can stay because she'll continue to age or not, you know.
Yeah,
that's true. Yeah, if only they made a sequel, we'll never know. Well, Jenny, Chris, thank you so much for coming on and talking about Final Fantasy IV with me. When I decided that this game was going to be something that I played this year, and I put on my backlog resolutions list and knew that most of those games would end up on the podcast, I had already hoped that you two would agree to come on the show. So I appreciate you two taking the time and your contribution to the discussion. Of course, this has been a lot of fun.
Yeah, a lot of fun, Dave. Thank you so much for having me. It was an honor to talk about Final Fantasy IV. I really haven't, like, as much as I love it, this is actually one of the Final Fantasy games I don't think I've talked a lot about. So happy to do it.
And I'm always happy to talk Final Fantasy IV. So I was really thrilled when you asked. Thank you so much.
Of course. Yeah. So thank you again to the both of you. Thank you to everybody who's listened to the end. We'll give one more plug to go down in the show notes and check for everything Retro Hangover, and then everything that Jenny is doing on the writing and podcasting side. Lots of cool stuff to check out, especially if you love Final Fantasy IV. A lot of good stuff, especially with Jenny's writing and, again, podcasting. So that is the end of the episode. Thank you, as always, everyone who listens to the end. You are my hero. And as always, tune in next week for the next game to come out of the backlog.
Hey, Nerf herders.
You sure you want to go with that?
Hey, everyone?
There we go. More inviting.
Have you ever had a movie that you really wanted to love, but something holds you back?
Or one that you did love in spite of a flaw?
Well, I'm Case Aiken.
And I'm Sam Alisea.
And on Another Pass, we sit down with cool guests to look at movies that we find fascinating.
But flawed.
And we try to imagine what could have been done when they were made to give them that little push.
We're not experts. We just believe in criticism.
Constructive criticism.
Sure.
So come take another pass at some movies with us.
And every now and then, we can celebrate movies that did it on their own, too.
You can find us at certainpov.com or wherever you get your podcasts.
Pass it on.
Welcome to Bits of Time, where we ask you the simple question, is this video game worth your time? And we're two brothers having a conversation about a game and why we loved it.
Or a difficult discussion about why I didn't or we didn't beat a game. So I hope you join us.
Because it gets pretty wacky sometimes with the questions we ask each other, and maybe a little heated every once in a while too. If you plan on sticking around, you'll be getting 2 episodes each month, the first and third Wednesday.
We also have a brand new debate-focused series, so if you want to be a part of it, join us.
Yeah, join us. Or, reach out, get in contact with us, and maybe you could be on the show with us and debating all kinds of things, granular or not. We'll see you then.